Hello, this is the Uncultured Podcast, and this is your host, Dan Locke the Great. And today I just wanted to go over some of my thoughts about Avatar the Last Airbender. I saw a lot of talks about how people just really didn't like the live action and about some of the changes that they made as opposed to the animated show and what they changed and everything that they're doing in the show. So I wanted to go over some of those changes and what I thought, or some of my personal opinions about the show, and what I thought they did wrong, and what they did right. But ultimately, I wanted to go over some. I see a lot of contention on the animated show as opposed to the live action show. And these shows are made for different people. I think that's what people need to realize. The animated show is made for 12 to 13-year-olds, and it's made for children. There is a lot of factors about that show that would only appeal to a child. And when it comes down to an adult who's trying to get into something like that, they are going to need people to almost act a little bit more mature in their thinking and not so just going back to playing or some nonsense. And there's a lot of like this filler stuff, what I would say is filler, in the animated show. And I'll break it down so you realize what I'm talking about. But so I've got about 5 or 6 points that I wanted to get through. My first point I wanted to get through is the character changes that happen throughout the show. And one of the first character changes that was really a shift from the animated show was Avatar's character himself. So Avatar's character in the animated show, he was very much a coward. He ran away from the Air Temple fight. He deserted his friends. And you would think from that experience that he would have a ton of just survivor's guilt, a ton of guilt and trepidation about that entire scenario. And when they do visit the Airbender Temple and he sees all the death, he does feel a lot of guilt from it. But the guilt doesn't really change anything about his character. And I had a lot of issue with that because guilt changes a person and it shapes them to who they are. And as it should. If you experience that kind of trauma in your life, you should be feeling it. And I feel like in the animated show, it feels like it happened to him like 100 years ago, and not that it happened for him like 2 seconds ago, which it did. For him, it was 2 seconds ago that he got stuck in ice, but for everyone else, it's been 100 years. So for him, he should be experiencing every single one of those emotions, and it should be changing him. But instead, right after he sees the Airbender Temple and all of his friends dead, he sort of has a breakdown, but then right after that breakdown, he goes over to Kyoshi Island and he immediately goes and swims with some kois. And it doesn't really make any sense. Because someone who has experienced some tragedy like that, they would grieve. They would grieve for multiple days at least. It would shock them to their core. And let's say that you are going with more the plan that maybe he was trying to avoid those feelings, or he wasn't trying to think about that. Well, it doesn't really show that in the animation. It more shows him just living, and it shows him just having fun, and it looks like he's actually having fun. There's no like some darker sense about him because of this death that he's had. Like, it hasn't affected him. And that's why I call these scenes where he's like playing with people filler because this is right after he's experienced some of the most traumatic stuff in his life, and he just immediately goes to joking around. Now, you could say that this was a coping mechanism, but the show doesn't act like it's a coping mechanism. The show doesn't act like this is some character flaw of his, that this is a coping mechanism, that he uses humor and goofiness to not consider his own feelings. When they go into the spirit realm, you feel like maybe that would have been a source of contention in the animation. They would have been like, hey, your goofiness is causing people to die, Aang. You are not considering the future at all. Now, I understand how this might appeal to a child, or how this might appeal to someone younger. They might, maybe they weren't paying that much attention when his family died, and so they just see him as having fun, like they would have fun. And maybe they aren't considering the ramifications that all of those deaths would have on a character. But in the live action, they take a different approach. And Aang, it seems like after he's told about these deaths, he seems to actually consider these deaths. He seems to actually care. And it looks like he actually cares. He doesn't just have that one breakdown. He acts a little bit more serious. And I think that's actually good for his character, because in the animated show, his character does not want to fight the Fire Lord. He does not want to fight this war, and I completely understand that. But his character also meanders and doesn't really have a goal in mind. He was like, oh, I sort of want to learn waterbending. And so I guess we'll go to the north. I guess. But they sort of just wander around to get there. But in the live action, they feel like they actually are trying to get to the north. Not that they're meandering around trying to visit these koi pond or this other nonsense. It's not that they're distracted and don't care about the future, because that is what it seems like in the animated show. It's like he had the trauma that should have changed him, but the trauma didn't change him. The trauma didn't do anything to him, which is really weird and not very relatable for an adult, at least. Maybe it's relatable more for kids, but for an adult, it's just not very relatable that trauma wouldn't change you as a person. And then we have Sokka. Now, I don't think that he changed really that much. He is still the leader of a tribe in the animated show and in the live action, and he still is a warrior. And the only thing they really changed about him was that they kind of slimmed down some of the sexism that he had. And honestly, it's kind of an improvement to the character, because in the animated show, he just has like some sexism in literally like 1.5 episode, and then they solve it. And that's not really like a real character growth or character change, if you ask me, because a real character growth or character change, it needs to be like expounded upon and shown in great detail and shown that he actually is changing. But in the animated show, it was more to sort of seem like you didn't even know why he was sexist. Like, you could make theories about why he was sexist, but they didn't state why. You could have said, oh, it was because all the men in his tribe left, or whatever. But you don't know that that's the reason. This guy just seemed like he was maybe sexist for no reason. So I feel like in the live action, they gave him actual character flaws. They made him think that he actually, he needs to protect his village, so he has a character flaw where he needs to be able to fight better. But his father never believed in him. And he saw that when he was a kid that his father doesn't believe in his fighting skills. So he's not very confident in any of the fighting he can do. And I feel like that is a real character growth and a real good change that I like, honestly, because I can relate to that, I can relate to someone not being all up there physically and not being able to do the things that they need to be doing. and not having the ability to do them. It's a very relatable problem for a lot of people. And the sexism line, it's not that relatable. Not people will generally realize that on their own, and they don't really need a show to tell them that. But if we could have a relatable problem in the show, I feel like that is way more impactful for the audience. And the second thing I wanted to talk about is the special effects and the fighting and the costumes and all of that VFX and all that stuff that they did. These costumes, just look here on the screen, these costumes look insane. They look so good. They're so vibrant, so colorful. And they have such a matter of like care and thought put into them. And you can tell that they costume designers put so much work and care into them. And then you look at these fight scenes, and they just like breathe with the intensity. You can feel the fire in those fight scenes. You can see the smoke, the real effect that it has on people. And I feel like that really is shocking, for the animated show. It was played more like the fire almost didn't feel real because you wouldn't see the death and the heartache and the matureness that you would like from a person getting burned alive, So the fire doesn't really feel all that scary. But in the live action, you see a man burned alive and you're like, this fire is scary. The stakes are now higher. You have heightened senses about these actual fighting mechanics because you actually care and you think that they could actually be hurt by them. In the animated show, you don't actually feel that much for your characters because the fighting never gets that tough. The fighting doesn't really get tough in the animated show until at least the second or third season. Or the end of the first season at the Northern Water Tribe. It gets a little intense. But that was about it. And the first episodes of the show, there was no intense fighting or anything like that. There was some fire bending. But honestly, it wasn't that scary at the end of the day. And you weren't that scared of any of these benders. But I feel like this gives an actual weight to the characters. It gives some actual stakes that people can grab onto and latch onto and not just feel like, oh, everything's going to be fine at the end of the day. There's some actual, stakes in there. And the third thing I wanted to talk about is the filler, or what I consider filler. Now, a lot of Avatar the Animated Show fans wouldn't consider this like filler, but I consider it filler for one very important reason. It's because the characters aren't following the characters that they should be. So, right after Aang gets out of his icicle, he goes and immediately goes penguin sledding. And I have no problems with that because he hasn't learned about any of the deaths that happened. So he doesn't know anything and he's just trying to be a kid. So that one I see as very on point for him. But then, right after he learns about his airbender terribleness, he goes and he immediately goes to try and play with the koi pond. He plays with the koi pond, he plays with the villagers, and he plays again with the kois again. All it seems that Aang wants to do is play and have fun. But Aang has experienced so much death and so much heartache that there is no way that he could be having this much fun. So when he laughs, those laughs actually in the animated show, they seem real. It seems like he's actually having a lot of fun. But someone who's experienced that much death and that much heartache is not going to be immediately having that much fun. They need time. They need actual time. And I feel like they don't give him that time at all. And that's why I say it's filler, because in a lot of like anime or works like that, they'll throw in a bit of episodes that are literally to pad the runtime right between right after like a big arc or like a big thing that happened. Like, so you'll have like a big arc where somebody almost died or something, and something crazy almost happened, and then you'll have like a bit of filler. But the fillers don't always match the characteristics of the people, because the characters, like, they should be feeling the loss of that arc, or they should be feeling some sort of way after they experienced all of that. But instead, they sort of ignore those emotions, and they just have like 2 or 3 episodes of just them having fun, which is to pad the runtime. But it doesn't make sense for the characters, and it never does. But what Avatar the Last Airbender in the animated show did is it took the filler that doesn't really match the characters, and it would pad the runtime of these episodes, and it would just insert them right into the episode. But it takes away from the actual characters' feelings, because you go, no, they should be thinking about that. They should be thinking about what just happened. They should still be in mourning, frankly. They shouldn't be able to be laughing this hard. It doesn't make any sense. And no, I don't think a 10-year-old should have the wherewithal to go through all the forms of grief. And it doesn't feel like this 10-year-old even experiences even one of the forms of grief. He experiences them maybe for like a second, and he'll have a breakdown for like a second, but then next scene he's going off and playing like nothing even happened. So the filler, I feel like, detracts a lot from the show, and I feel like this is a really great thing that the live action did. It really just cut out that filler, so you feel like the character actually is in tandem with his emotions, and he is acting like a normal person would, and it feels so much more realistic to people. And you feel more in touch with the character because you can actually relate to that and that heartache that he went through, instead of him just brushing it off and ignoring it. And then another point I wanted to go over, the fourth point, I would say the overarching story. Now, at the beginning, it seems like in the animated and in the live action show that there isn't really an overarching story. Like, maybe they want to defeat the Fire Lord, but both of them don't really want to go to war or anything like that. But then they introduce going to the Northern Water Tribe to learn waterbending. And in the live action, the character is more serious about it, and he actually wants to get there. And it seems like he actually has that goal of wanting to get there, and like they are actually on their way to that place. But in the animated show, the character meanders around, and he doesn't really know what he wants out of his life. And yes, that is relatable to a young child, that they don't know what they want out of their life. But it is really hard for storytelling. And storytelling, it is hard for me to relate to a character like that, because you feel like, where is this story going? You can't feel an end. You don't feel like it's going anywhere, frankly. You need that overarching story. You need that overarching plan to keep you engaged in the story. Otherwise, you will feel that you are going nowhere, and you will feel like this is some sitcom where each episode doesn't really matter, and you could skip 5 episodes ahead, and it doesn't matter, because the overarching story isn't there. So the animated show, it doesn't really keep you engaged to want to continue. Now, I wouldn't say that's really a fault of Aang or anything like that, because people not having goals is a very real thing in our world, and that's very realistic. But it is a thing that you can't really do for a show, because if someone is meandering like that, the viewer themselves doesn't really feel engaged enough to want to continue on to the next episode, because they see it as no goal in mind, so they go, well, what am I here for? And they don't really see the purpose. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the nostalgia. And I feel like a lot of the people who watch the animated show, they have a lot of nostalgia attached to this show, and it really matched with their humor. And they were really mad about how the live action took out a lot of that humor and didn't replace it. But what I would want to say to that is that humor is the most subjective thing in the entire world. So if you didn't grow up with Avatar the Last Airbender, or with that kind of humor that Avatar the Last Airbender has, then you would never appreciate those kind of jokes. You never would. Because humor is one of the most subjective things in the entire world. And this show wasn't made for the fans of the animated show. This was made for a new audience to get into the show. So they don't want to be held down by the humor that was used in the animated show that might not really appeal to everyone. And I feel like we have a lot of people just have these wrong expectations that builds that they were trying to like. They have these wrong expectations that really just brought down the show, and they were like, hey, we wanted these things to happen, these specific things, and these expectations were never going to be met. They never were, because this is to attract a new audience and a new people, and the show does something right. This live action show, what it does is it goes more into the emotional aspect of these characters and into their trauma and takes a more mature feeling of the animated show. It makes it so that adults can enjoy it. Because an adult is not necessarily going to enjoy the animated show if they didn't grow up on that kind of humor or if they didn't grow up liking that sort of animation. They're not really going to appreciate it. And also, a lot of people are saying, well, why can't you just translate it 1-to-1 or something like that? Well, a lot of that kind of comedy or kind of goofiness that is seen in an animated show is not really translatable into a live action at all. They have faces that don't make any sense. You can't translate those. They have more expressive faces in an animated show, sure, but actors and actresses cannot translate that. They never could. And I would just like to point out the One Piece live action. The One Piece live action, they had a very hard time of translating any of the humor from the animated show. And I'm glad they did not translate a lot of the goofiness, because it would have looked off. It would have looked so weird. Because their expressions and their facial expressions would have looked terrible. Now you might say, well, why do we even have live actions in the first place? Well, here's the thing. Live actions appeal to the people who actually just don't like animation at all. There is a significant portion of people who will never like animation, and they would never get into Avatar the Last Airbender. And now they can because of this live action show. And honestly, it changes the show, and it shows that new fans can be attracted to this even if they weren't into the humor of the animated show. So even if you didn't like all of that playing around and all of that meandering towards a finish line aspects of the animated show, you can still get into the live action because it cuts out that fluff, as I say it, and it really gets to the point and the meat of the show, which is the emotions and the feelings of the characters. Now, I would also like to bring back the point of episode number 6. It introduces the 41st, which is the group of soldiers that Zuko was banished from the kingdom for. He was banished because these soldiers were going to be basically used as a suicide run attack, and these soldiers would have been all killed in the suicide run. He went against the general's plan, and they banished him for it. But they gave him the crew of the 41st, who were all going to be used in that suicide run. But the 41st, throughout this entire season, they hate him, they berate him, they tell secrets about Zuko. But Zuko, he never told him that they were the 41st. He never revealed that secret or anything. But then, Iroh, the general who's with him, tells them that they were the 41st in this story, and they see it as they owe their lives, which they do to Zuko, and they then honor him as a prince and as their leader. And it is so powerful of a scene, and it's more powerful than anything in the animated show does in its entire runtime in that book 1 of Water. It's more powerful, and it really has made people cry and feel these real emotions. Now, when I watched the animated show, I never really got into it. I didn't understand the humor, and I didn't really cry or have any crazy emotions or anything. I thought some of the fight scenes were cool, and I liked some of the plot points. But most of the time, it wasn't really that engaging. But when I watched this live action one, I really got into it. And I really saw the emotions of the people, and I could really feel their heartache and their fears and their wants and desires. And I feel that this live action has made me see Avatar the Last Airbender in a whole new light. That I can now actually appreciate the show and what it was trying to do because of it. Now, I never really appreciated the animated show, and I feel like some people are missing the point that the live action show isn't really made for them. It's made for new fans. Just like I would say the One Piece live action isn't really made for me personally, it's made for new fans. I loved One Piece growing up. And yet, the live action, it changes a lot of things from the anime. And there were changes that I liked, obviously. That they completely changed and they took out things that I really liked and they didn't include other things. But I wasn't angry at the show because I know that it's for a different audience. It's so my parents can watch it. Because they would have never seen the One Piece show. And this is so you can get a new audience, and it really shows people that heart and that desires they were missing, and it shows them that amazing stuff that you experienced. And I feel like the Avatar the Last Airbender live action really gets a whole new audience in, and it shows them those emotions that they couldn't experience in the animated show because either they couldn't relate to those characters or the humor wasn't right or something else. But it really brings it for a new audience. And Avatar the Last Airbender was a great show. And honestly, I liked it more than the animated show, and there might be a lot of other people who also like it more than the animated show.